Thank you very much. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Lars to take us through what they do. Thank you, Lars.
Okay. Thank you, Barbara, and thanks, Milka, for the preparation, and Connie also for the preparatory conversations. Um, and I see Sonia coming in as well, also another very engaged member of Culture Action Europe. I want to thank you mainly for the opportunity to be with you today and discuss the work of Culture Action Europe. But as Barbara has said, hopefully in the light of what it means to you and to gather feedback from you, because if we talk about advocacy for arts and culture, that is a very lofty term, and it doesn't mean much if we do not put meat on the bones from the very specific experience of cultural workers on the ground. So from your institutional, from your personal professional practice, it would be great to get into a conversation. I will give you with a PowerPoint an overview about three things. Actually, in the first part, I will talk a bit generally about what Culture Action Europe is and does. In the second part, I will dive a bit deeper in the State of Culture report that we have issued in October last year and that we are discussing in the run-up to our annual conference in Torino, where some of you will be present. And then I will quickly look at the current campaign that we are running, which we call Ask, Pay, Trust the Artist. Not all of the points, for instance, of the State of Culture report might be of direct relevance to you. And Barbara, if you say specifically with regards to participatory art, socially engaged art, there are some slides where I will dig a bit deeper and others where I will just rush through to give you the full picture. And I will share my screen now. Let's see if that works. Yeah, there we are. And I will start with who we are. I mean, this is the text that basically Barbara already has used for the introduction. But maybe what I would like to add at this moment is, by the way, the numbers are not right anymore here. We are 260 at the moment. We are growing in the last 2 years rather quickly. But these are abstract numbers, and it's maybe good to realize that from the 260 members, we have roughly 50 members that are transnational cultural networks, such as Amateo, which is interesting because altogether we are forming that choir, to use that metaphor while Sonia is in the room, towards the policymakers. And of course, each individual voice is important because they stand up for very specific part of the cultural sector, as you do for amateur arts and participatory arts. But I think there are some aspects like working conditions that we all share across the networks, and where it does make sense that there is a coordination between the networks and how they form a voice towards policymakers, which is basically our main mission, to be the political voice of the cultural sectors in Europe. And that means mainly in Brussels towards the EU institutions, but also to the Council of Europe in Strasbourg, which is more around human rights and freedom of artistic expression, and to the UNESCO in Paris, which looks at culture more on a global scale. This is how we work, very schematically, and that there is advocacy as one specific action area is a very specific notion of advocacy. I would argue that the whole circle that includes advocacy, capacity building, knowledge production, and knowledge sharing together forms a strong advocacy, or a lobby, as you also may want to call it. Let's start with knowledge production. For us, that's very much projects and events, like the event you may attend in Torino, where we discuss with one another and where we, amongst the membership, develop ideas, opinions, positions that we then need to share. And then we can knowledge sharing, the next one in the circle, through publications, future images, again, events. And through that, we create a strong ecosystem that together has a voice, which is advocacy, and bringing that advocacy forward to the members again. That what we learned from policymakers, feed that back to our members. That would be the capacity building, and then we've got a full cycle. You may read the words encoding and decoding. I think that's maybe very black and white. Our main activity most of the time to be a sort of postillon d'amour between the cultural sectors and the policymakers. One of our most popular members only publications is our Brussels Decoder newsletter that we publish 10 times a year, where we basically translate what happens in Brussels into normal human language. That's why we call it decoder. We are decoding the policy conversation in a way that you and I can understand it. And in the same way, we are also aware that how we discuss within the cultural sectors is not necessarily easily understandable for politicians. I give you one example that relates to you probably. I hear a lot of politicians talk about participation. And if you dig a bit deeper, you will realize that they often use it as synonym to access to culture. They want more people to participate, which means more people to buy tickets. And we would, of course, argue that participation is something distinctly different. It's about co-creation, co-ownership, collaboration, developing content together with communities. And there, we need to encode what we mean into their language. We've got at the moment 4 overarching advocacy priorities. I will dig into more details later, but that's the rough bigger picture. The first one is the strategic framework for culture, which is at the moment sailing under the heading of a cultural compass. The European Commission wants to publish a new cultural policy document in autumn this year. That keeps us busy a lot, and I'll dive a bit deeper into that later because it will probably determine what will be happening on a European level in terms of culture for the next 5 years at least, which will include, for instance, priorities in funding programs such as Creative Europe or other related funding programs. So, which it will have a direct impact on how we work. Then speaking about funding, the EU funding, of course, because the new MFF, the new multi-annual financial framework, the budget of the EU will be negotiated in the next 2 years, which will be a budget that we will have to work with for 7 years. And I think the main battle is to secure a standalone Creative Europe program, because a lot is happening under different headings at the moment: security, defense, competitiveness, democracy. So we have to be very firm to make sure that the culture is not only anchored in the current priorities, but has their own funding line. Working conditions is a big priority for us in the last years, and it will remain a big priority. Fair pay, the status of the artist, social conditionalities, but also, and that's already the next point, artificial intelligence and the digital shift, of course, also impacts on working conditions because there are a lot of copyright issues and authorship issues that we need to take into account here. Now, the question is, of course, always how we formulate our positions and opinions when we are in conversation with policymakers. And of course, we do consultations, surveys, have discussions during member meetings. But last year we decided to do a thorough analysis of where the cultural sector in Europe stands at the moment, and have commissioned a research that we call the State of Culture in Europe, where we initially thought, we get a comprehensive snapshot, short and concise. We thought 15, 16 pages, maybe a little discussion document. The researcher that did it, Elena Polivtseva, whenever we met with Elena, she came with more material, and we looked at the material, and it got more and more interesting. So at the end of the ride in October, we published a rather comprehensive report of 186 pages, where we looked into all published national and EU cultural policies. Not all EU countries have a published national cultural policy. Then we looked at their funding programs that they are running and the priorities in the funding programs. And with the EU cultural policies, we looked at the last 10 years of priorities that they've been working with. We have been conducting a barometer, what we call a State of Culture barometer, which was basically a survey. Expert interviews with 17 organizations, an analysis of members' publications. We held workshops and did a lot of desk research. If you don't know the study, I'll talk you through it now, because it is really a sort of baseline for where we stand in Europe at the moment. This is not a policy recommendation, but it's rather a mirror that we want to hold up for ourselves, to see where maybe our own narratives about ourselves are not really matching the narratives that others tell about us. And that tells us something about how we relate in discussions. Wait a second. Now I can't. No, that's. Of course, this all happens as a sort of against the background of multiple crises, and we see that overall, an overall conclusion is that policymaking, when it comes to culture, is dominated by responsiveness. So there's not a big grand vision of what culture could do in Europe, but it's really responding to immediate problems like the climate crisis, for instance. There is a very short-term focus. The longitudinal perspective of our work is still incomprehensible for many policymakers. We need to run projects in a time frame from 2 to 4 years, and we need to show impact, immediate impact. We cannot, there's no trust that whatever we do may have an impact only in the further future. And there is a big dominant paradigm of calculation versus imagination. So the lack of political vision or imagination when it comes to cultural policies is compensated by calculation. So the culture is there to create jobs, to solve problems, to impact on health and well-being. It's very instrumental and often based on Excel sheets rather than strong narratives. And of course, there's a lack of trust in the unpredictable, and arts and culture are perceived as unpredictable. So the question is, what is culture at the moment? Are we an equal partner of other policy areas? Are we a tool to solve problems, or are we neither? Let's dive into it. I'll share with you the 10 main observations of the report. With number one, and probably the most important one, is that the growing instrumentalization of culture does little to improve the sector situation. Now, what do we mean by instrumentalization of culture? Of course, we would always say that we in the cultural field can be and want to be instrumental to transform the societies into a more sustainable or towards better futures. But in reality, we are subsumed to policies such as a growth agenda, where more economic turnover has to be created or jobs have to be created. And that is something where we had hoped in the past that would improve our situation. I remember, Jan Willem and Connie, I'm quoting Dutch examples now. When I moved to the Netherlands, there was a a big organization that was very dominant at the time, Cultuur en Ondernemen. I think that's where we met dear colleagues, because all of a sudden there was this idea that ondernemerschap, entrepreneurship, would be the salvation of the cultural sector, at the heights of the neoliberal paradigm. Of course, meanwhile, we know that that it was delusional. Of course, we can be a little bit more entrepreneurial, but at the end of the day, we are offering a foundation of a society like education or healthcare, and we are not there in the first place to generate return on investment, but we are there to work with people and provide a basic human infrastructure. Observation number 2. There is a gap between how policymakers value culture and how the sector sees its own role. Back to the example I mentioned earlier, one priority that we found in all cultural policies across Europe is that of access to culture. And of course, we would argue, of course, we want more people to be able to access culture. But in the same questionnaire, when we ask colleagues, they would see the main role on the top ranking of our role as being transformative to our societies. And that transformative power is, of course, by engaging people, by engaging more people in the act of culture, not only in consuming culture. So there is a discrepancy between access and participation, which is significant, and where we need to look at how we tell our stories and how we are persistent on where we see ourselves impact as opposing to where others see it. Then observation number 3, in times of crisis and waning political trust, the sector adopts the instrumentalizing view on culture. Now, that's maybe the most confronting one for us. And I must say that I recognize that difficulty immediately, because if you ask me to explain about the intrinsic value of culture, I will start waffling and tell you a very long and winding story with a lot of aspects. But the very clear narrative why culture has a foundational role for our societies, and only from that autonomous role, we also contribute to health and well-being. We also contribute to a sustainability agenda. That story is something we need to build together in a much stronger and more concise way. So has instrumentalization been useful for the cultural sector? Of course, that's a rhetorical question. No, it hasn't. We have been jumping on that train from politicians to kind of please the funders and show them what we do to contribute to other policy areas. And it has resulted in a drop of investment. Cultural budgets are shrinking across Europe. Working conditions are still precarious. There's still a lack of political recognition. And cross-sectoral collaboration is really fragmented. So the question is, should we keep on using these narratives, or should we really radically rethink how we advocate for our sector? Observation number 4, that's a bit of a no-brainer. AI, artificial intelligence, compels us to confront critical questions about why we value human creativity. And I think it's much more, it's more on a meta level. It's not so much, about copyrights and protection of authorship and all that. It's really about how do we relate to artificial intelligence? What's the agency of artificial intelligence versus the agency of an artist? I think there are fundamental conversations that are happening in a fragmented way, and that we should have in a much more systemic way. Number 5, the autonomy of culture shrinks in the face of new threats to artistic freedom. I think that's something we scarily observe all across Europe, that freedom of artistic expression is severely attacked. There are many countries with speaking examples. In Czech, leaders of cultural institutions being sacked by politicians in the Czech Republic. You see what's happening in Germany, which is really leading to a sort of censorship and also self-censorship. of artists, what they can or cannot produce. It is so severe that we need to really look into instruments. At the moment, Culture Action Europe is looking at the possibility to adapt the European Democracy Shield to include freedom of artistic expression as one of the instruments that we could use to force member states to secure their freedom of artistic expression. Number 7, and that's something where I think Amateur could dive deeper. I've mentioned in the beginning that we did sent out a little survey to the networks where we want to see which network has worked on specific aspects and might want to lead specific aspects in the future. I think when it comes to that one, Amateur has a lot to say, and we could learn from you. This observation is about culture who can save democracy, because that's something we've heard. Invest in culture if you want to safeguard democracy, which is under threat in the world for sure, but also in Europe at the moment. But only if it is democratic itself. And there is the little caveat where a lot of awareness raising needs to be done still. You may be aware of you're probably aware of the Porto Santo Charter from 2018, where the Portuguese presidency of the EU at the time has looked into what is needed to make cultural institutions more democratic, which role the citizens have, institutional leaders and policymakers. How can we become more representative of the communities in which we are embedded? How can communities be involved in creative processes? All that needs a lot of attention. There hasn't been any significant follow-up other than from you, for instance, from the networks, but on the policy level, there has been no significant follow-up. And I think the aspect of cultural democracy is one that we should maybe in the discussion now dive a little bit deeper as well. And number 8, the culture and climate debate is marked by unresolved contradictions. And one contradiction is, of course, that we, cultural sectors, cultural beings, cultural practitioners, are very good in leading by example and trying to become greener ourselves. Also, there's a conditionality in most funding programs that we show how we green our practices. But the question is whether we use the potential of the cultural sector well enough to change the narrative, where probably our real potential would be to really change the narrative about the climate crisis throughout societies, and thereby trigger a much broader transformation process than focusing on how, I don't know, our buildings could be more sustainable. Observation number 9, the role of the EU in cultural policy making is limited yet crucial. You know that the cultural competencies of the EU are limited to mobility, transnational cooperation, cultural capital, and cultural capitals, more or less. And the member states have cultural autonomy. But everything that happens on European level, we could very clearly pinpoint that across the years has shown that cultural policies that have been formulated on a European level 10 years ago have had an impact on national policies 3 years later. If you follow through, you can clearly see that the limited scope of the EU has still triggered a lot of change across the EU and its member states. And the last observation, we need a policy scaffolding for culture as a field in its own right. And with policy scaffolding, we might mean the compass that is in the making at the moment, but we really looked at what Justin O'Connor in his book, Culture is Not an Industry, has called the foundational role of culture in a foundational economy. How can we create a cultural infrastructure that is well funded, with fairly paid workers, that offers a possibility for cultural participation for every citizen. And that is, we call it a scaffolding because we don't want to be too prescriptive how it should look like. Infrastructure sounds very much like buildings immediately, but we really mean a support structure with legal regulations and money. So this whole report, which is available on our website, also as a summary, I urge you to look at the summary because the whole one is maybe not good for your mental health. It's really a trigger for us to define culture in its own terms, to restore also sort of self-worth, self-esteem for ourselves, because so far we very much define us through other sectors, and to start acting as an ecosystem. And I think there is where we see very much the role of Culture Action Europe to kind of celebrate the diversity of the cultural sectors, but also make sure that we feed each other very much like a permaculture garden grows through the presence of each other. And that's why we have chosen this new logo for ourselves, because we want to be that beautiful ecosystem. Now, before I close and open the conversation, I know it's a lot of information, but I'm still, I hope I can add a tiny bit more. Because to make that all concrete, that was a study, so that's the background. That's something we just have to have in mind. It's basically the facts, if you wish. But we've translated that now into a campaign that we have recently launched 2 weeks ago, with which we want to impact on the Cultural Compass, so the new policy that the EU is drafting at the moment, the budget that is being negotiated in the next 2 years, and the work plan for culture, which is something like the culture policy for the council, which is the head of states. That is also not unimportant in the interplay of the institutions. And we've called the campaign Ask, Pay, Trust, because of course we think that in all the big transformations that our societies are going through in all policy areas, we think that in all discussions we need an artist at the table. It doesn't matter if it's about urban regeneration or sustainability or research. It is proven that the messiness, if you want to, in a positive way, of artistic thinking is something that greatly pushes all the discussions forward. Of course, after you've asked an artist, we want them to be paid, so pay us fairly, and then trust the way we work. So key performance indicators from other sectors don't work on us. We impact in different ways, and we have to have the opportunity to show, especially when it comes to participation also, that you can't just parachute an artist into a community and then after a year report on the impact. It's a longitudinal thing. It's something about responsibility that we take by building up relationships that require a long process. So that is a trust that is lacking at the moment. There are 3 overarching priorities in the EU at the moment, and we are not happy with them, but they are there. So, and I don't want to be opportunistic here, but everything that Ursula von der Leyen sets out in Europe at the moment is subsumed under the headings democracy, competitiveness, and security, because democracy is under threat, because Europe is not competitive in the world anymore, and because we've got a war on our doorsteps. Now, we think, okay, if those are the headings at the moment, we have to deal with them, but let's define them on our own terms. So when it comes to competitiveness, we think, of course, that we should be competitive in the world through a set of values. We would speak about value competitiveness, but that includes that, for instance, we value artistic work and we need fair payment. We acknowledge culture's role in driving innovation, but not economic innovation, social innovation, and innovation in a sustainable way. When it comes to democracy, we of course think, and I've said that earlier, that we need to make the cultural sectors more democratic, and we have to really dig deeper into cultural democracy, which means we need a fundamental investment in culture at the moment. We argue for at least 2% of the overall budget of the EU in the future. At the moment, the investment is 0.02, roughly, depending on what you count in or not. I know that's a big increase, but if you look at the facts that every euro invested in culture gives you 11 euro return on investment, and you compare that, for instance, with agriculture, to name but one iconic area that receive 19% of the EU budget and that contribute 1% to the overall GDP of the European Union, then I think asking for 2% for culture is almost modest. Then the last one is security. And Connie asked me in the beginning, what do you do with security? And we've published an open letter that we sent to Ursula von der Leyen and other commissioners, where we urge the politicians at the moment that, of course, we understand that security is a big issue. Rearm Europe is a big issue. We feel threatened. We lost our allies. The Russians are coming. All that, is a reality. But at the same time, we see that countries like Ukraine or Finland have a firm role of culture in their security policies, where it is recognized that although we need to defend our borders, we also need to defend social cohesion, togetherness, belonging within a society, and that there's a psychological component of keeping people healthy and the community well-being on a higher level, where only culture can play a role. So if we talk about Rearm Europe, let's make sure that culture is in the conversation. So with that, I close my part of the presentation. I invite you to go to our website to look at the State of Culture report, which you will find easily, but on the main page, you will now see the campaign also, and which you can endorse by putting your signature there. But there's also a campaign pack where you can download a lot of material you can work with and you can use, because we need to spread the word and be loud and outspoken about our pleas, because only if we keep repeating and keep shouting, unfortunately, that's what it requires to be in the conversation. I'm sorry, I dumped a lot of details on you, but you are totally free now to pick 1, 2, or 3 aspects out of it that you would like to dig deeper and ask questions or comments, and I'm happy to use the rest of the time. Oh, it is almost 22. Yeah. I didn't want to speak so long, to use the rest of the time for conversation. Thanks for listening.
No, that's absolutely fine. Thank you, Lars. That was really interesting. I'm sure everyone agrees. Are there any immediate questions? Has anybody want to come forward to ask anything? Otherwise, I might ask a question. Oh, Alan, go on, Alan.
Okay, thank you very much, Lars. I'm kind of going to jump in a bit deep here, because just as to what culture is. So I see there's a definition in the report. I've been Googling while you've been talking. So it says the distinct spiritual, material, intellectual, and emotional features characterizing a society, encompassing arts, lifestyle, human rights, value systems, traditions, and beliefs. Culture shapes individuals and societies, fostering unity through shared values and traditions. My impression of Culture Action Europe, it is primarily to do with arts and heritage and culture. So it's a very small subset of the overall definition of culture. And I mean, arts is a very kind of a vague term in itself. And just wondering, in terms of advocacy, in terms of talking to politicians, in terms of talking to EU government, are they clear what culture means in a the narrower sense, perhaps, that we're talking here, or are we talking in a narrower sense?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a super important question, also an extremely difficult one, because I think you were citing the UNESCO definition, which is indeed very broad and where there's a lot of discussion whether it should be made more specific. I think in our case we are talking about that part of culture that involves cultural workers, where someone is involved in making culture. And that, of course, includes the amateur arts and participatory arts, but it is arts, culture, and heritage. That's just what makes it specific for us, and also to counter a reaction that unfortunately we get a lot. For instance, we had our annual policy conversation on the 4th of February in Beaux-Arts, where I don't know, the commissioner was and the head of the cult committee and MEPs, and there was a very engaged new member of parliament from a Center Democratic Party that said, luckily, whatever happens, even if we don't have a budget anymore, artists will still produce art. So, luckily, we don't really need to care, in other words. And that's where we would see our main role to say, no, you need to care. It's of course, there's always, people will always need to eat and will always sing a song or will always tell a story to their kids. But if we want to pull it on a bigger level to have an impact on how our societies develop in a more just, fair, and sustainable way, we need to think about that scaffolding I was talking about, and I think that distincts it maybe more from the anthropological definition of culture is everything.
But I can just a little response to that, something to throw in might be helpful for discussion. For myself, I just think of culture is, everything that we learn and teach socially and everything that comes from that. That's a hugely wide definition, and we can see that in other non-human species as well. But in terms of what we're talking about here, it's possibly a motivation. So lots of people in the arts work for money. There are commercial arts, but I think there's a motivation that is primarily not economically based. And whether we're working for money or not, I just find I do lobbying in Ireland myself with politicians, and I find it difficult to go to them and get the right definition for them so that they know exactly what I'm talking about. And unless we define culture for them kind of each time, they don't kind of see how long the piece of string is. Anyway, just thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think my comment may be a little bit in your direction, Alan. So I found the use of intangible cultural heritage quite useful, that that term, because it's takes us away from buildings into certainly what my members do, and they're amateur musicians. So but yeah, that encompasses a lot more. The United Kingdom has only just signed up to the UNESCO intangible cultural heritage, what's it called? Convention. And so they're actually wrestling with that definition at the moment, and they are including foods and traditional sports and things like that. So it's quite interesting. But Veronica has a question. Veronica?
Yes, maybe it's a little bit more pragmatic on the advocacy side. I found it really interesting how you broke down the different advocacy issues that you're working on. And I mean, being in Belgium, we also have like a few big battles coming up, I think, around just making arts happen and protecting the status of artists. But who are the allies of kind of the cultural sector in the moment? So what are the alliances that you think you can build on in this advocacy? What is something that works, that is there?
Yeah, good question. I think there's a big shift that has been happening in the last half year, and so far, I must say it's a positive surprise. Before the European Parliament elections in June last year, we were rather afraid of the right-wing shift, which we are still afraid of course. There has been a right-wing shift, and the coalitions of majorities we can work with are different. Like I can be very frank, in the old days, I would have said, okay, the EPP, the European People's Party, is of course a good party to work with, but it's not the natural first go-to of the cultural sector, which is traditionally more social democratic, green, progressive. Now, at the moment, the EPP is the only party that secures a center democratic majority. So, of course, we are speaking to them as an ally much easier than we did in the past. And it turns out to be a good conversation. Also, to my joy, but it was a hard lobby. It kind of cost me the whole July holiday last year. Not only me, but other colleagues as well. We managed to get a Volt party, Green party, black young woman as a chair of the Cult Committee in the Parliament, Culture and Education Committee, who is very, very engaged and a fantastic ally. And we have gotten a commissioner for culture that is a 35-year-old, also young, Labour Party politician from Malta, who has little experience, but who is extremely ambitious. So in the EU institutions, we've got allies at the moment. That hasn't been the case before. The commissioners before were unresponsive and invisible. This commissioner is in all the conversations and available all the time, as well as the parliament. I think where we get to a glass ceiling, so to speak, or what the real problem is, and then of course we've got a DG Air, the directorate, the civil servants, they're super responsive. So in a way, I keep thinking whether we should swap the term that we advocate for better policies, that we should get away from that policy makers thinking and go more towards politicians, to be political. And by that, I mean that regulating things in policy papers is something that we know how it works, and we've got allies. We can bring the right terminology and the right regulation. But what is really preventing us from real change is that, Ursula von der Leyen not even mentions culture one time in any of her State of the Union speeches. In her political manifesto for this year, I think cultural heritage was in and agriculture was in. But like, how can you, as the leader of a cabinet of the union, not relate to? So in a way, we can have a fantastic commissioner, but if that commissioner is not empowered by the president of the commission, then we get to limits. So in a way, I think we need to step up our game and say, okay, we've got great allies, but if there's no political vision top down, then there are limits, and I'm afraid that there is no political vision on culture at the moment.
So you're saying, I think, that the priority is raising that awareness, right, amongst all the politicians at Europe level. So
Exactly.
hopefully your network should be able to help you do that, right? We should all be able to. Yeah. So okay. So Connie.
Thank you, Barbara. Well, Lars, first my compliments in how wonderful you structure all the different fields of arts and culture. My question, well, my struggle is related to what you also said about the instrumentalization of culture. We see that some of our members are very, very much involved in the act of culture instead of the consuming of culture, because they are fighting a corrupt regime. I will not mention any names, but I think we all know who we are talking about. And we see that the cultural sector in that country, in those countries, is very much involved in that kind of activism. We have this wonderful member who does terrific programs with arts and culture and mass tourism. And Amateo is there for their advocacy. But it's also such a struggle to find a way how to support the members who are in an insecure situation in relationship with their governments, with the financial relationship with their governments. How can we support them better?
I'm afraid I don't have an answer for that, because I mean we are all struggling with that. But I mean, for me, the instrumentalization issue that you mentioned has a lot of dimensions. First of all, I think the terminology is tricky, because of course I believe that we can be instrumental for many other policy areas. I mean, Culture Action Europe, we are ourselves running major programs for culture, health, and well-being. So, I mean, we believe that we can be instrumental for other policy areas. But if we start with the instrumental position, then and it doesn't give us more support overall, then it gets problematic. Then we get distracted from the real fight, which I think lies in the autonomy of our sectors, and that's where it goes into towards the colleagues that are having difficulties, and to the trust issue, where I think conditionalities in funding programs that dictate us how the cultural funding should be spent is a very instrumental view, and there should be trust in our autonomy that we make the right choices, how we spend the money for what, because we are the ones that work with communities and we know what matters to people at the moment. And that's what I mean with instrumentality. And of course, that plays also to the autonomy of, freedom of speech, freedom of artistic expression, and which often is influenced through, money. In some cases, people can be sacked directly, and that's equally horrible. But the funding is, of course, the big issue, and I think we cannot do anything else than try to make stronger the instruments that are there, that are in place, like the European Democracy Shield, for instance, and include art and culture into that shield as well, so that there are instruments to punish governments who threaten the autonomy of our members in these countries.
That was still quite an elaborate answer. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. Sorry to be long.
No. Thank you for being long.
I wonder whether some of the instrumentalism that we're talking about is really a different version of encoding that you talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? I find myself translating what my members do into the language of the health service, for instance, or something like that. So,
exactly.
but that's just sort of an observation. But Antje.
Yes, thank you very much. I really wonder if you have any specific advice for amateur artists, especially amateur artists. We're coming from the Federal Music Association in Germany, and we are representing as an umbrella association over millions of people who are making music in their leisure time. So often we are in concurrence with financial and private distress of our members and the ones who make music. So it's not only the financial aspect, but it's as well that it's complicated just to come together and just to produce arts and to co-create, and it's not getting easier. So if you have any advice for us on the national level, or any hint for us what we can do to put ourselves in a better position, that would be great as well. Also, if you have any like views on the value of amateur arts, especially if you see the democratic shield or the democratic events, which maybe are one of the few that Ursula von der Leyen and the Commission hint at. Yeah, that would be great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, that's super relevant. I'm afraid that I'm not so knowledgeable about what's happening on different national levels, but I think overall, it's what I referred to earlier, that I think we need to reinforce or open again, because it's not really there at the moment, the discussion on cultural democracy, where, of course, socially engaged arts participation, but also, amateur arts, or the creativity of all citizens come into play as a enabler for citizens to be to attain a democratic agency. Because if we are not engaged in creative processes that think about better futures, so to speak, how can we be democratic citizens? So there's a line of thinking where what we need to drop into the heads of politicians, because only then they will understand that, amateur arts is not just about, personal hobby, whatever what they would normally say, but that it has a deeper structural democratic role. So that's a discussion that we need to step up, and it's a discussion that we want to lead in Torino, by the way, at our annual conference this year in June, where we have the title Being Many. And of course, we have the title Being Many because we think we are many. We are not only a small sector. We are all the citizens that should or could potentially be culturally active. And that's the change of narrative that we have to push.
Absolutely, that's so interesting. Thank you, Lars, because I believe that what we fundamentally try and do in my organization is to empower people to do the culture that they want, right? So we give them the tools, and I think possibly Anti's organization works similarly. So that contributes to their being an active citizen in other respects in society. Jan Willem, I think yours may have to be the last question.
Okay, Lars mentioned culture and climate. Lars also mentioned Ursula von der Leyen, that she doesn't mention culture anymore. But we shouldn't forget that Ursula von der Leyen gave us new insights and tools. She created new opportunities, considering the new European Bauhaus. We should remind her of the new European Bauhaus. I was in the think tank from 1999 till 2021. And it's the aesthetic translation of the European Green Deal. And there are so many chances there. And now I made years ago a career switch because I was sick and tired of all the time legitimize and defend arts and the participatory arts. So I think also the arts should not only defend itself and be sure that they have a place in policy, but also to have an active role and what could be the new role for the arts. So you have to look for new opportunities. And if you have a look on the new European Bauhaus, it's about creating beautiful, sustainable, and inclusive places, products, and ways of living. So there are so many opportunities, and I made that switch already years ago, and now I'm setting up projects with agriculture money for the arts. There are so many opportunities, so we also should take an active role in finding new ways as the arts.
Definitely. I can just agree. Yeah. Although I can agree, but I have been and I'm still skeptical about the impact of the new European Bauhaus, and also not so sure it will survive or not. But with your general observation, I agree, definitely.
Okay, I think I'm going to start wrapping up here. I think in this room we are all agreed that culture is incredibly important, however you define that in precise detail. And it's really interesting to hear from Culture Action Europe the thinking that they have done and the campaigns they're putting forward on behalf of all of us, their members. And so I would encourage everyone to carry on reading and signing up to the campaigns, and or coming to the conference in Turin if you can. So thank you very much, Lars, for giving us your time. And everybody, the recording will be on the Amateur website when Milka's had a chance to look at it. And do email us with any further questions that we can pass on to Lars or answer ourselves. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming, and have a good day. Okay.
Thank you too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.